The judge thought the case was over. The HOA thought they had won. But neither of them realized the only road leading into their subdivision had always belonged to me. I still remember the sound of polished dress shoes echoing across the courthouse floor as everyone filed out with smug little smiles. Melissa Bradford, the HOA president, walked past me carrying a stack of legal folders against her chest like she had just conquered an empire. Her expensive perfume drifted through the hallway, mixing with the faint scent of old paper, fresh coffee, and floor wax that every county courthouse somehow shares. She looked over her shoulder long enough to flash the kind of smile that wasn't meant to celebrate justice. It was meant to humiliate the man she thought she had finally beaten. I didn't smile back. I simply reached into my pocket, wrapped my fingers around an old brass key polished smooth by 3 generations of Carter hands, and waited for my phone to ring. It came exactly 43 seconds later. The county engineer didn't waste time with small talk. "Mr. Carter, the court order has been entered. We have confirmation. Are you authorizing the gate closure?" I looked through the courthouse windows toward the western hills where 1,600 acres of dry Texas grass rolled beneath the afternoon sun exactly the way my grandfather had left them. Every fence post, every live oak, every limestone marker carried a story. Most people looked at that land and saw empty ranch country. My family saw 80 years of sweat, droughts, cattle drives, and promises that were never supposed to be broken. "Go ahead," I answered quietly. "Lock it." By the time Melissa reached her luxury SUV in the courthouse parking lot, county trucks were already heading toward an old steel gate almost 20 miles away. That gate wasn't dramatic. It wasn't beautiful. Rust stained its hinges, the chain rattled whenever the wind picked up, and the faded private property sign had survived more thunderstorms than I could count. But what nobody in Willow Creek Estates understood was that the weathered gate protected more than my ranch. It protected the only legal access into their entire subdivision. They had spent 2 years suing me over land they claimed was standing in the way of community growth. They hired surveyors, engineers, consultants, and attorneys who charged more per hour than my father earned in a week building fences. They stood before cameras calling me selfish, unreasonable, and anti-community. They told reporters I was holding progress hostage. What they never bothered to ask was why my grandfather had refused every offer to sell that narrow strip of gravel cutting across the edge of our property. He always had the same answer. "One day this road will matter more than the ranch itself." As a kid, I thought he was talking about cattle trucks. Standing outside that courthouse with the afternoon sun warming the old brass key in my hand, I finally understood exactly what he meant. 80 years before anyone in Willow Creek Estates ever imagined building luxury homes beyond those rolling hills, my grandfather, Walter Carter, stood exactly where that old gate still hangs today, with a shovel over one shoulder and a survey map folded inside his back pocket. He bought the ranch in 1946 after coming home from the war with little more than determination and enough savings to purchase land that everyone else thought was worthless. 1,600 acres of limestone ridges, mesquite trees, dry creek beds, and open pasture did not look like a fortune back then. It looked like hard work. My father used to laugh and say our family never inherited money. We inherited blisters. Every sunrise started with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through our ranch house before daylight painted the hills orange. By 6 o'clock, the sound of diesel engines, cattle gates, and boots crunching over gravel became the soundtrack of another day. Some of my earliest memories were riding beside my dad in an old pickup whose air conditioner had stopped working sometime before I was born. He would point toward distant fence lines and ask me who owned them. When I answered with a neighbor's name, he would shake his head. "No, son, we do not own land. We take care of it until it is someone else's turn." That lesson stayed with me long after he was gone. I never became the biggest rancher in Texas, and I never wanted to be. I studied agricultural engineering at Texas A&M University because I wanted to understand how to preserve what my family had spent generations building instead of selling it piece by piece. I learned about soil conservation, water management, property records, and something most people never think about until lawyers become involved: access rights. Back then, those classes felt painfully boring. Years later, they would become the reason I slept peacefully while everyone else panicked. When developers first started buying property near our western fence line, I honestly welcomed them. New families meant stronger local businesses, better schools, and improved roads. I shook hands with contractors, answered survey questions, and even let construction crews refill water tanks from one of our wells during a dry summer, because good neighbors help each other. That was how my parents raised me. Then Willow Creek Estates appeared almost overnight. Perfect sidewalks replaced open pasture. Decorative stone entrances rose where cattle once crossed. Every month, another row of identical rooftops stretched closer to my fence. I still remember standing on a hill one evening watching porch lights flicker on across hundreds of new homes, while the smell of fresh asphalt drifted through the evening breeze. Progress itself never bothered me. What bothered me was how quickly people forgot what had been there before. Within a few years, newcomers spoke about my ranch as though it were an used space waiting for a better purpose. They never saw generations of family history beneath those fields. They only saw opportunity. Melissa Bradford saw something even more valuable. She saw the last piece of land standing between her neighborhood and everything she wanted it to become. She simply assumed that sooner or later I would surrender it the same way everyone else already had. Melissa Bradford never raised her voice because she never had to. She had mastered something far more effective than shouting. She could make a polite sentence sound like a warning and turn a friendly smile into a contract you never agreed to sign. The first time she introduced herself, she arrived at my ranch wearing spotless white boots that had clearly never stepped through a cattle pasture before. A silver luxury sport utility vehicle stopped beside my front gate, its engine humming softly while the smell of heated leather drifted through the open door. She climbed out carrying a gift basket filled with gourmet coffee, local honey, and a glossy brochure showing the future expansion plans for Willow Creek Estates. At first glance, she looked like someone trying to welcome a neighbor. Looking back now, I realized she was studying the battlefield. We sat on my porch overlooking the western pasture while cicadas buzzed through the summer heat, and a warm breeze carried the scent of cedar and dry grass across the fields. Melissa complimented everything she saw. She admired the ranch house, the old oak trees, the cattle, even the rusted gate standing a quarter-mile away. Then she unfolded a colorful site map across my wooden table. New parks, walking trails, a community lake, hundreds of additional homes. Every drawing stopped just short of my property line. She smiled as though she already knew where the missing piece belonged. "Your ranch is beautiful, Ethan," she said. "It would be wonderful if the community could enjoy more of this area." I answered the same way my father always had whenever someone hinted at buying land. "People are welcome to admire it from the fence." Her smile paused for the smallest fraction of a second before returning as though nothing had happened. Over the next year, she kept finding reasons to visit. Sometimes she wanted to discuss emergency access. Other times, she claimed utility companies needed temporary construction routes. Then it became questions about widening the gravel road near the western boundary because delivery trucks were increasing. Every request sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I politely declined each proposal, explaining that the road remained private property exactly as it had been for decades. Melissa never argued. She simply thanked me for my time, climbed back into her vehicle, and drove away with that perfectly rehearsed smile still painted across her face. A few weeks later, the letters began arriving. Invitations to homeowners association meetings, even though I had never belonged to the association. Community newsletters discussing transportation improvements. Surveys asking residents to support expanded neighborhood connectivity. My mailbox filled with cheerful language hiding increasingly serious intentions. Then neighbors I had known for years started repeating the same phrases almost word for word. They talked about shared progress, modern infrastructure, and doing what was best for everyone. It sounded less like conversation and more like a script. One afternoon, I drove past the subdivision entrance and noticed a large presentation board standing outside the clubhouse. Families gathered around colorful renderings showing a grand boulevard lined with trees stretching toward the west. I did not need to ask where that boulevard ended. Every painted lane ran straight through my ranch. Standing there with the smell of fresh mulch and newly poured concrete hanging in the air, I realized Melissa had already convinced hundreds of people that something they had never owned was simply waiting to become theirs. The certified envelope arrived on a cool October morning, tucked between a feed catalog and my electric bill like it belonged there. I could smell fresh ink before I even unfolded the papers. The return address carried the logo of Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, embossed in dark blue across heavy paper that felt far more expensive than it needed to be. The first sentence stopped me cold. They were no longer asking for permission. They were demanding permanent access across my property through the courts. According to the filing, my refusal to allow expansion of the road had allegedly harmed property values, restricted emergency services, delayed future development, and placed unreasonable burdens on hundreds of homeowners. I read every page twice while the wind rattled the old porch swing beside me. By the time I reached the final signature, the coffee in my mug had gone cold. Melissa had stopped pretending this was about cooperation. Now she was betting that the legal system would force me to give away what generations of my family had protected. The weeks that followed became a blur of meetings, paperwork, and long drives to county offices. Every conference room smelled exactly the same: recycled air, burnt coffee, printer toner, and polished wood tables that had witnessed thousands of disagreements before ours. Melissa always arrived surrounded by attorneys, engineers, and consultants carrying oversized maps covered with bright lines and impressive labels. They projected traffic studies showing future congestion. They displayed artist renderings of tree-lined entrances and smiling families riding bicycles along the very road they insisted should belong to the community. Sitting across the table, I almost admired how polished their presentation looked. Almost. Because every colorful exhibit quietly assumed one thing that had never been true. They acted as though my land already existed for their convenience. Outside the courtroom, the pressure became even harder to ignore. Newspaper headlines described the dispute as a conflict between one stubborn ranch owner and an entire growing community. Social media filled with comments accusing me of blocking progress. Some people who had once waved when passing my fence now drove by without looking in my direction. A local hardware store owner whom I had known for years hesitated before asking whether I had considered making a compromise for the greater good. I smiled politely because he did not know the full story. Neither did anyone else. Even my attorney admitted the situation looked difficult. He spread survey maps across his desk one afternoon and rubbed his forehead before speaking. "Ethan, perception matters almost as much as documentation. Right now they have numbers, experts, and public sympathy." I looked through his office window toward the courthouse across the street and thought about my grandfather standing beside that old gate decades earlier. He had never cared about popularity. He cared about facts that survived long after opinions disappeared. I left my attorney's office carrying a briefcase that suddenly felt heavier than it had that morning. As I unlocked my pickup, I noticed a thin layer of red Texas dust settling across the windshield. It reminded me of the ranch waiting beyond the hills, quiet and patient beneath the setting sun. Melissa believed the case was becoming larger every day because more people stood behind her. I had a different feeling entirely. The louder everything became, the more certain I was that the answer had been sitting somewhere on my family's land all along, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to find it. The breakthrough did not begin inside a courtroom. It began in the quietest building on the ranch. 2 days after another exhausting legal meeting, I unlocked the weathered storage barn my grandfather had built decades earlier. The air inside carried the familiar smell of cedar, machine oil, dust, and old paper that had been resting undisturbed for generations. Sunlight slipped through narrow cracks between the wooden boards, leaving thin golden lines across shelves filled with rusted tools, faded photographs, and metal filing cabinets that nobody had opened in years. I was not searching for a miracle. I was searching for anything my family might have overlooked. Hour after hour, I sorted through yellowed tax receipts, livestock records, handwritten notebooks, and rolled survey maps tied together with brittle cotton string. Most of it told the ordinary story of ranch life. Rainfall measurements, fence repairs, feed deliveries. Then I noticed something that made me stop. Hanging from an old nail beside my grandfather's workbench was the same brass key I had carried out of the courthouse years later, except this one was attached to a small leather tag with faded handwriting that simply read, Westgate. I turned the key over in my hand, feeling the smooth edges worn down by decades of use, and suddenly remembered my grandfather refusing to let anyone replace that old lock even after newer hardware became available. At the time I thought he was simply stubborn. Now I wondered what he had been protecting. Beneath the workbench sat a heavy wooden chest covered in dust. Inside were dozens of neatly organized document tubes, each labeled, in my grandfather's careful handwriting, ranch wells, mineral rights, fence agreements, county surveys. Near the bottom rested one tube that looked older than the others. The label had almost disappeared, but I could still make out two words, original access. My pulse quickened as I carefully unrolled the brittle papers across the workbench. The parchment released the unmistakable scent of aging paper and ink that had survived longer than many of the people connected to this dispute. The first sheet contained an original property survey from the 1950s. The second showed boundary descriptions I had never seen before. Tucked behind them was a folded document with county recording stamps so faded I could barely read the dates. I did not pretend to understand every legal phrase, but one thing immediately stood out. Certain portions had been underlined in blue pencil, almost certainly by my grandfather himself. He had marked them for a reason. Instead of rushing to celebrate, I photographed every page, placed the originals back into protective sleeves, and drove straight to my attorney's office before sunset. He studied the documents in complete silence while the only sound in the room came from the soft ticking of a wall clock. Every few minutes he adjusted his glasses, compared one page against another, and reached for additional county maps from his bookshelf. The longer he remained quiet, the more nervous I became. Finally he leaned back in his chair, looked directly at me, and asked the one question I never expected to hear. "Ethan, has anyone outside your family ever seen these originals?" I slowly shook my head. A faint smile crossed his face for the first time since the lawsuit began. He closed the final folder with deliberate care and said, "Do not mention these documents to anyone yet. If they mean what I believe they mean, the entire case has been built on an assumption that may never have been legally true in the first place." For the next 3 weeks, my attorney and I stopped trying to win arguments and started collecting facts. Every morning before sunrise, I drove to the county records office with a notebook, a thermos of black coffee, and copies of the documents my grandfather had hidden away all those years. The archive occupied the oldest building on the courthouse square, where the air carried the unmistakable smell of aging paper, leather bindings, and furniture polish. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with record books so heavy that moving one felt like lifting a sack of feed. The county clerk watched with quiet curiosity as we requested deed after deed, subdivision plat after subdivision plat, tracing ownership back through decades instead of stopping where the developers wanted everyone to look. My attorney insisted we verify every page, every signature, every recording stamp. Nothing would be assumed. Nothing would be left open to interpretation. Late one afternoon, after comparing an original survey against the subdivision filings, he slowly pushed both documents toward me. The property descriptions lined up exactly as my grandfather's paper suggested. The gravel road crossing the western edge of my ranch had never been transferred, dedicated, or conveyed to the county. It had remained private property the entire time. Even more surprising, the subdivision approval referenced access that everyone simply assumed already existed without creating a permanent recorded easement across my land. That assumption had survived for years because nobody challenged it. Developers changed. Homeowners moved in. Board members came and went. Everyone kept using the same road, and over time convenience quietly replaced careful legal review. My attorney leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "This explains everything," he said. "They built their entire strategy on practice instead of recorded rights." I stared at the faded survey lines while the words settled in. The road had not become public because people drove across it. It had not become community property because hundreds of families depended on it. Ownership had never changed simply because everyone acted as though it had. That realization carried an unexpected weight. I did not feel excited. I felt responsible. Hundreds of families had purchased homes believing everything surrounding their neighborhood had already been resolved. Most of them had probably never heard my grandfather's name. They were not the ones making legal demands. They were simply living with the consequences of decisions made long before they arrived. That understanding shaped every move we made afterward. My attorney instructed me not to celebrate, not to speak publicly, and certainly not to reveal the newly discovered documents before the proper time. Instead, we quietly hired an independent title expert, requested certified copies from the county archives, and commissioned a fresh boundary survey performed by a firm with no connection to either side. Every new report reached the same conclusion. Piece by piece, the evidence fit together as neatly as fence rails locked into old cedar posts. Meanwhile, Melissa continued acting as though momentum alone guaranteed victory. Her legal team filed additional motions, issued confident public statements, and expanded their presentation for trial. Watching from a distance, I realized they were preparing to prove a version of history that existed only because nobody had ever looked closely enough at the original records. For the first time since the lawsuit began, I no longer worried about how loudly either side argued. I cared only about the quiet stack of documents resting inside my attorney's locked file cabinet, because those forgotten pages were about to speak far more clearly than either of us ever could. The morning of the trial arrived with a cold breeze rolling across the courthouse square, carrying the smell of damp pavement from an overnight shower. My boots clicked against the stone steps as I walked toward the entrance with a single leather briefcase in one hand. Inside were certified copies of every document we intended to present, each one organized in the exact order my attorney believed the court needed to see them. We were not carrying surprises. We were carrying history. Melissa and her legal team filled nearly an entire row outside the courtroom. They greeted one another with confident smiles, reviewed presentation boards covered with enlarged maps, and spoke in calm voices that suggested they believed the outcome had already been decided. As I passed them, Melissa nodded politely and said, "I hope today finally gives everyone the resolution they deserve." I returned the nod and answered just as politely, "So do I." That was the only conversation we had. Once the hearing began, their attorneys presented first. They displayed traffic projections, emergency response studies, engineering reports, and photographs of the gravel road stretching across the western edge of my ranch. Witness after witness described how the community had depended on that route for years. They repeated the same theme in different ways. The road had been used continuously, everyone expected it to remain available, and changing that arrangement would create significant inconvenience. Listening from the defense table, I understood why their arguments sounded convincing. They were describing what people believed had existed. They were not describing what had actually been recorded. My attorney never interrupted. He took careful notes, occasionally underlining a sentence before sliding another document closer to the top of our stack. During every recess, he reminded me of the same instruction. Stay patient. Let them finish building their case exactly the way they planned. Hours passed before the judge finally invited our side to respond. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Even the steady hum of the ventilation system seemed louder than before. My attorney stood, thanked the court, and instead of beginning with opinions, he walked to the evidence table carrying the oldest document in the room. The original survey from the 1950s rested inside a protective sleeve, followed by the recorded deed, the access language my grandfather had preserved, certified county records, and the independent boundary survey completed only weeks earlier. One by one, each exhibit was authenticated and entered into evidence without exaggeration or drama. Then came the moment I will never forget. The independent title expert explained, in clear and measured language, that continuous use of a private road does not automatically create ownership rights when the recorded chain of title shows otherwise. He pointed to the official county filings, compared them with the subdivision documents, and demonstrated that no permanent recorded easement had ever been granted across my property. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The room simply became quieter with every page that appeared on the courtroom display. I looked across the aisle and noticed Melissa studying the enlarged survey with a different expression than I had ever seen before. For the first time since this dispute began, she stopped looking at my ranch as a future project and started looking at the original records. In that silent moment, I realized the case was no longer about confidence, public opinion, or elaborate presentations. It had become exactly what my grandfather always believed it would be, a question answered by the documents that had been waiting patiently for decades to tell their own story. When the judge returned to the bench that afternoon, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper were the only sounds left. He carefully reviewed the exhibits one final time before explaining that the decision rested on recorded property rights, not assumptions, expectations, or years of informal use. Every sentence was calm, measured, and unmistakably clear. The original deed remained valid. The certified surveys confirmed the property boundaries. The chain of title had never been broken. No permanent recorded easement had ever granted unrestricted access across my land. With those findings, the court ruled in my favor. There was no dramatic celebration. My attorney simply nodded once, closed his legal folder, and quietly shook my hand. Across the aisle, Melissa remained perfectly still, staring at the same documents she had dismissed only days earlier. As we walked out of the courthouse, my phone vibrated almost immediately. It was the county engineer, calling exactly as he had promised. The judgment had already been transmitted to the appropriate offices, and because the road remained private property, the county could no longer treat it as unrestricted public access. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we are ready to proceed whenever you authorize it." I looked toward the western horizon where the late afternoon sunlight painted the hills in deep shades of gold. I reached into my pocket and wrapped my hand around my grandfather's old brass key. "You have my authorization," I replied. Less than an hour later, county vehicles rolled slowly toward the familiar gate that had stood on our ranch for decades. There were no flashing lights, no raised voices, and no confrontation. Survey crews verified the boundary markers one final time before Public Works employees replaced temporary traffic signs with official notices explaining that access beyond the gate entered private property. A new chain passed through the weathered steel posts, and the same brass lock my grandfather had protected for so many years clicked firmly into place. That quiet metallic sound echoed across the open pasture far louder in my memory than it ever did across the fields. News traveled through Willow Creek estates faster than the setting sun. Residents returning home discovered traffic redirecting them toward alternate routes that added miles to their daily commute. Delivery drivers paused to study the new signs before turning around. Navigation applications began recalculating directions as mapping services updated access information. Confused conversations filled neighborhood sidewalks as homeowners tried to understand why the familiar entrance was suddenly unavailable. Most of them had never realized that the road crossed privately owned land. They had simply trusted that someone else had handled those details years before. Watching everything unfold from the hill above my ranch, I felt no satisfaction in their inconvenience. Most families there had done nothing wrong. They had purchased homes believing every legal issue had already been resolved. The true consequence of the ruling fell on the people who had built years of plans upon an assumption instead of verified records. By sunset, Melissa's attorneys were already requesting emergency meetings with county officials and transportation planners, searching for solutions that should have been considered long before the first lawsuit was ever filed. Standing beside the old gate with the scent of cedar drifting through the evening air, I rested one hand on the cool steel chain and finally understood why my grandfather never replaced that worn brass lock. He was never protecting a road. He was protecting the truth that ownership is established by careful stewardship and lawful records, not by confidence, convenience, or the passage of time. 3 weeks after the ruling, the atmosphere around Willow Creek Estates had changed completely. The confident public statements had disappeared, replaced by quiet meetings, engineering reviews, and careful legal conversations that should have happened years earlier. One crisp morning, I received a phone call from Melissa asking whether I would be willing to meet at the ranch. There was a long pause before I answered. "Yes," I said, "but this time we meet at the gate." When her vehicle rolled to a stop beside the weathered steel entrance, she stepped out without the polished presentation boards, expensive brochures, or confident speeches that had once accompanied every visit. The old brass lock remained exactly where it had always been, catching the morning sunlight while a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar, dry grass, and fresh earth across the pasture. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Melissa looked at the gate and quietly admitted, "We should have examined the original records before we ever filed the lawsuit." It was the first completely honest sentence I had heard from her since this entire dispute began. Over the following month, our attorneys worked through an agreement that respected what should have been respected from the very beginning. The Homeowners Association would purchase a properly recorded easement instead of attempting to claim one through litigation. Every survey would be completed using the verified property boundaries. Maintenance responsibilities would be clearly defined. Insurance requirements would be documented. Access would exist because both parties agreed to it lawfully, not because one side assumed it could simply take it. The association also accepted responsibility for substantial legal expenses created by the failed lawsuit. More importantly, every future property disclosure would accurately explain how access had been established so that no homeowner would ever face the same uncertainty again. On the day we signed the final agreement, I unlocked the old gate using my grandfather's brass key. The familiar click echoed softly through the quiet morning, sounding less like the end of a dispute and more like the closing sentence of a story that had begun generations before I was born. County officials inspected the completed documents, recorded the new easement, and confirmed that everything now reflected the public record exactly as it should. Residents once again drove through the entrance without realizing how close they had come to living with a problem that could have lasted for years. I never blamed those families. Most of them simply trusted that someone else had done the difficult work of protecting their interests. Standing on the ridge above my ranch that evening, I watched the last light settle across 1,600 acres that looked almost exactly as they had when my grandfather first walked this land nearly 80 years earlier. The fences still stretched toward the horizon. The old oak trees still cast long shadows across the pasture. The weathered gate still stood where it always had, no longer as the center of a legal battle, but as a reminder that patience can outlast pressure, facts can outlast assumptions, and careful stewardship can outlast ambition. My father once told me that land remembers the people who respect it. After everything that happened, I finally understood those words completely. The greatest victory was never proving someone else wrong. It was proving that integrity, preparation, and the quiet truth preserved inside forgotten records will always stand stronger than confidence built upon convenience. Justice does not need to shout. It only needs the truth to be remembered.